So hello, welcome everybody. My name is Steve Teresi. I'm the VP of Technical Services here at JL Audio. I am joined by my buddy Matt here. Say hello, Matt.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining.
And over on the West Coast, we have Mr. Rob Haynes, the man, the myth, the legend from Southern California. Please say hello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us as always.
All right. We also have a man behind the curtain that we will introduce in just a few minutes. Is Mr. Nick Ames, who will join us momentarily. But before we get too far into things, today we're going to talk about managing your inputs when you're getting ready to do system tuning. And this is a topic that we've kind of chatted about a lot here about how we can kind of guide people towards using different tuning methods. Obviously, with Tune and Max is really the goal. But we wanted to give you some insight into the different ways that we can get signal into an audio system so we can actually do the highest level tune that may be possible on a given car. That about right?
Sounds right to me.
So we have put together a brief keynote presentation that we'll start with, and then we'll jump into some live demonstration. So I'm going to let Matt take it away.
Well, thank you, Steve. All right. So this session today, we're going to go over different inputs for tuning vehicles. And as you guys know, there are many obstacles that come with cars today in 2022. There's a lot of different input methods. There's optical signal, analog signal, there's Bluetooth. There's so many different ways that you can get signal into the vehicle. And sometimes it can be more tricky than others. So what we have to do is we have to determine what's going to work in which use case. So today we're going to start with why we use a reference. And if you guys remember from all the previous trainings we've done, reference is very important to bringing signal into a max where you can compare the measure signal to the reference signal. So you have so it's relative to something, right? So if there's no reference, then the measure doesn't really mean much, especially when it comes to time measurements.
Right. So basically, we define a reference that we measure towards. So if that's a frequency response, that could be a target curve. And if it's like Matt said, in the case of time, we need a beginning of time. We need something where it starts. So this timing reference is often pretty tricky in some of these factory systems you may be working with, of being able to get a signal, a known signal into the audio system and use that as a reference. Frequency response and level is somewhat easier to manage. Defining your reference or your target is a big part of that. But this timing thing, this ability to see impulse response and phase measurements is a little bit harder. So that's one of the things we're going to dive in pretty deep with today. But we kind of want to go through the entire system flow from the easiest way to get signal in to the hardest way to get signal in. And then we'll try to guide you along, and we'll take any questions that we can.
All right. So we talked about a reference, why we use a reference. The reference tells us the beginning. The measure signal tells us the end. So that sort of creates a loop in time, right? So when you're measuring a signal in time with impulse response or phase, you need a reference to be able to see these things for them to make sense. Without a reference, phase becomes unreadable, as you may have seen in some of our previous trainings that we've done. The other thing a reference allows us to do is set up transfer function engines in Tune software, so we can compare two signals, right? So without the transfer function, we can't do impulse response or phase. On to the next slide here, we're going to go look at what happens when we don't have a way to inject signal into the factory system, right? If
you're done, you can't do anything then.
We're done.
Just might as well fold up the tent and go home, right?
Should we just get rid of the car, tell the customer to go somewhere else?
Tell them you're not a candidate for audio.
Right. So if you have no auxiliary input, and what we mean by auxiliary input is like a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack that you could use the RCA output out of Max and convert it to a headphone jack to plug into the signal. When you don't have that, what do you do, right? And like we talked about with new cars, technology is very different. It's not as simple as the old days where every car is just straight analog signal out. So first thing we do is we consider a preamp solution, right? There's a bunch of brands out there that offer preamp solutions. Pack Audio, Nav TV. There's a couple different ones that you can get that integrate really well to the car so that you can get a full range, clean signal out into the amplifiers.
Magical.
You know, it kind of is like magic because they're not correcting the signal. They're actually catching it before the OEM makes any changes to it, right? Wow. So really nice to have those preamp solutions because it gets us that flat full range signal, which is very important. And I feel like along the way we've sort of lost that. And a lot of times we're like, oh, well, we can just send high level into VXI amplifier because it can take 16 volts, and we'll just go with that. And
sometimes you can get away with that.
Right.
However, there are better options sometimes.
Right. It's not always a bad option. It's just not the best option. Right?
Not always the best. Yeah.
Right. So a couple other possibilities are, can we intercept that signal before it gets to the factory amp? Some vehicles you can actually, if you measure for it, you can actually pull the radio out and grab signal and find that a lot of cars actually do have a flat full range signal coming out of the factory radio before it gets to the factory amp. And obviously some don't. Some are digital and coax, and there's all different ones. But if it's not a data configuration and they just like, for example, like Nissan Titan has a preamp signal that you can grab. It's flat, it's full range. It contains all the data required. Bluetooth and nav prompts all come through those wires. So everything we need, we can get before the factory amplifier, before all that post the amplifier processing.
That's good. That's what we want.
Right. That's exactly what we want. So what aftermarket parts are available? Like we talked about, if there's a nav TV or preamp pack preamp solution, that's
there may be others,
method,
yeah.
Right? Other brands, Mobridge or some other ones that make them. If that's not an option, can we change the factory radio?
Yeah, that's usually a big no, but
yeah, with newer cars, it's becoming. I don't have to tell you guys, it's becoming less and less possible to easily swap the factory radio.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that being said, unlikely is the answer to that. We probably can't. So, the next option is we roll with the factory post processing, and we make a separate preset for a 2-channel input. Now, that's a really good solution that I don't think a lot of people take advantage of.
I would agree.
Because they get a decent sound from the factory radio option, and it's less work. It's just easier to let it roll that way, and it's pretty simple to create a second preset and tune that and have a second preset. Now it's a little more for the customer to understand. The customer has to know how to use a DRC, but the pros of this are.
Or was that on me?
What's that? What, Rob?
Oh.
Can you hear us?
I hear you. I wasn't sure if that was on my end or on your guys' end.
We were going right away. I didn't hear anything.
All right. Well.
All right. So the second preset, the pros of that are you get to sell another part, right? You get to sell the DRC 205. You get to charge to install that, as well as potentially charging for another preset, right? So you make more labor dollars off of this, and it takes a little bit more time, but the customer gets a result that is likely much better option than a post-processing result.
Just for clarity on the Tune software when using VXI and MVI and Tweak as well, but for today's conversation, we'll stick with the VXI. You have the ability of creating another preset that can have a separate input or different input, and in fact can have different signal routing as well. So the suggestion here is that if you don't have access to any of the other options that we just talked about, that's on the screen right now, you can make a second preset and send your signal like from your phone or from your music player directly into that separate preset on your amplifier using a different set of inputs and route that through your system. Then as a user, you just toggle on your DRC, it's our remote control, you toggle that to a different preset, and you can go between the factory input and the external input. And what this allows us to do is all our time-based measurements can then be done through the amplifier directly, since we're not actually using any of the factory electronics on that preset.
It really is a smart way to do things. That's what I've done in my car. So I have an Acura TLX that has the ELS system, which uses a DTS neural surround sound processed mixed, right? So because of that, I have a center channel, speakers all over, not really something that is nice to work with when we want to have a flat, full range, more traditional 2-channel or stereo, audio system. And there's no integration interfaces for my cars. When I first tried tuning my VXI system in there, I tried to work with the factory signal. I went straight from the factory amplifier channel to channel directly into my VXIs. And then I started noticing all pass filters. I have suck outs on, certain drivers in the car that were not frequency response related. Stuff that really makes it almost impossible to properly not just tune a system, but get time-based measurements, get the analysis we need to make the right decisions. So in my case, what I did, and it was actually Nick's advice, was go just directly from my iPhone. I bought a couple of, after doing some research, bought a couple of adapters that let me go Toslink out. So I connect my phone to these adapters, which have a Toslink cable directly into my VXI system. And I completely have bypassed the factory system. Now, yes, that means my steering wheel controls, all of that stuff doesn't work. I literally have to do everything from my phone in terms of skipping tracks, selecting what I want to play. And then, of course, I use my DRC 205 for my master volume and subwoofer control, which for me, it's fine. I wanted that proper audio experience. And I can still go back to the factory system on a different preset if I want to listen to the AM, FM, or if I need to do a Bluetooth call or navigation or anything along those lines. But by going digitally in, like when I'm tuning with Max now, I just unplug the Toslink cable from the adapters that go into my phone and plug it straight into my Max's output. So now I still have the same signal to work with, and I have a better overall audio experience because I bypassed all of that messed up stuff. Now I will say, this says no auxiliary input. Really, a lot of this stuff, even if there is an auxiliary input, you still have to make sure you use the right interfaces to get that proper, perfect rolled flat full range response. Right. So even if the car does have an aux input, you should still always take electrical measurements of the output of the source unit or of the amplifier to make sure there's nothing there that's going to cause any issues if you can't get something that gives you that flat full range response.
Right on. Excellent points. So it did bring up something in my mind. A lot of what we're talking about is a way to get a timing reference in because we want to be able to align the entire system in time. It's the third of the three pillars. Pillar one would be frequency response. Pillar two would be level. And then the third one would be phase or the time response. And by having a timing reference, we can do that. Now, there are cases where you may not care about that, or you may not need to worry about it. Matt's going to get into some of that in just a moment. But what I like to share with you, a lot of times, you hear us talk about flat, full range, and time coherent. That's what we're looking for, because that's all three pillars starting from basically zero, starting from a reference point. Again, why do we need a reference? We need a place to start, and that reference is a really good place. Now, there are some cases where people say, don't even bother getting flat full range, just tune it on the back end. And while that can be very useful in some applications, my concern is if there's boost and cut already applied to a frequency response, you're going to have to counteract that more often than not. So I kind of view it as an inefficient way of doing it. You're burning horsepower to kind of get back to zero and then additional horsepower to get where you want to be in terms of the actual tuning. Yes, in some cases, it's not that big of a deal, and you can do that. But I like to start from a nice clean sheet of paper. I don't want to kind of work the drawing back to the way I want it. I want to make it, from the ground up, the tune that I'm looking for. So that's why we always look for the flat, full range, and whenever possible, time coherent if we have the ability to look at that time stuff. And I think Matt's going to be able to guide us through some of that in just a moment. So thank you for the contributions, Robin. I think it's an important one that if there is no other way, at least there's that way, right? That you can go channel by channel and just do exactly the same thing. And if that second preset is kind of a neat trick. So
absolutely.
All right. So next up, what if there is nothing? We have no preamp solution, then we have no way of doing some of this stuff. Are we totally screwed, or?
Well, it depends. So we have some other options. So if there's no preamp solutions available, how do we proceed? First, we need to determine some things about the factory system, right? So one of the things you hear about a lot about is an up mixer, and we need to know, is this system upmixed? Because how we handle an upmix system is going to be very different than how we would handle a system that's not upmixed, right?
What is an upmix signal? I hear it all the time. What does that mean?
Well, an upmix signal is a signal that they take left and right, and any common information that is the same between left and right, they extract and they send that to the center speaker, right? And then anything that is solely from the left becomes only in the left speaker, and anything from the right goes in the right speaker. So the left in left center right is not the same as the left in stereo left and right. It's different.
Gotcha.
So an upmix signal has these these changed signals that are no longer like the original. An upmix, what is an upmixer used for typically is to have better imaging from two seats in a car, right? So the driver and the passenger both have a really good image.
But if I understand right, most of the recordings that people are using are done in standard 2-channel.
That's correct.
For audio listening. So this upmix would be something that somebody else would make from that stereo recording.
That's right.
So ultimately, it's up to whoever did the upmix to determine if it's good or bad.
And when you say good or bad, that's sort of subjective.
It is, yes. And
okay.
Go with
right.
That.
so with an upmixer being, it is sort of subjective how they actually determine what is going in the left, what's going in the right, how much content is there in each speaker individually. So there is no set way to do it, right? Like stereo is set left and set right, and anything that is in both appears to show up in the center if the system is designed properly and everything's aligned in time, phase, and level, the 3 pillars, right? So how we can determine this, we have to know what's required for an upmixer to work. Like we talked about, what an upmixer's purpose is to get things to come from the center speaker.
Supposed to.
Right. So is there a center speaker? That's the first question we need to know, because if there's not a center speaker, it's not upmixed. You don't have to keep playing around and trying to figure out if it is or not. If there's no center speaker, it's not upmixed. Now, if there is a center speaker, there's some fairly easy testing that you can accomplish to determine whether or not it's upmixed, right? So what we can do is we can take a left only or right only signal, and we can play that through the factory radio. And if it's left only and you hear it come from the left speaker and it also comes from the center speaker, then that means that it's a mono center. Left and right are likely summed together. And that's why you hear the left from both the left speaker as well as the center speaker. So what happens if you don't hear it come from the center is you would then try a regular track that has both left, right, and common information and see if you now have information coming from the center. And if you do, then there's a good chance there's an upmixer. And there's a lot of information on the different groups on Facebook.
So if left only presents in the center as well, then there's no upmixer.
Correct.
Okay. And after you do that test, the next test would be to play something that has information in both left and right channels, and that would normally present a strong, solid center. And then that would definitely have an upmixer, or
no, it could.
Okay.
Not definitely, right? If there's nothing in the center, right, when it's left only, but then there's something there when it's not, I would contend we should do some more digging on that car and see, what you've come up with, what other people have come up with. There's a lot of information on the Facebook pages and information out there that is related to these upmixers. And a lot of the cars that have upmixers, people already know about. And so if you find yourself in one of those situations, then we recommend, do these tests first. And then if you determine it might have an upmixer, maybe do a little more research online, see what other people have said about it.
Can you turn these things off, or are they like permanently?
So in my experience, some cars can be disabled, right? So some cars have settings like a surround versus a stereo setting. And if you select the surround, sometimes it'll enable the upmixer and the stereo may not. Rob, in your car, does it work like that?
Yeah. So one thing I was going to say, like a telltale sign, typically, if you have an upmixer, is like Matt said, in the one, you can always look for the branding. Does it say Logic? Does it say DTS? Stuff you would typically see in a home theater, surround system. But also go in the settings. Like in my car, I can't turn the ELS off. It changes the processing, but the center channel still plays. So I think it more changes what the rear speakers do for more spatial effects instead of being regular speakers for the people in the back. So it really does, you just got to, it really for me, it comes down to what are your goals? If you're, going from an upmix to a 2-channel system, it is different. And it may not be what, if you're a retailer, what your customer is going for, or if you're the user, what you're looking for. Because while we can improve the power, we can improve the tonality, the imaging may not be what you want, being you're used to a more surround sound effect. So
Right.
You got to know what the end goal is. And, you know, if we can get around it with the direct way in, that's great. But if not, then, you know, you got to figure it out. There may be some compromise. We may not be able to do the proper 2-channel tune because we don't have a proper signal to work with. There was a comment that Scott posted in the chat that sometimes in these cars, you do have a full range rear speaker. And if that's the case, you could try using that as your input to your DSP. And that way we have a reference. But you also got to make sure you're not going to lose door chimes, navigation,
right.
Bluetooth, or any of those things. So again, there's always research that needs to be done before you can just go in and, you know, grab channels.
Yeah.
So something that I always thought about is, and Matt kind of touched on it, is why would there be an up mixer in the first place? And as Matt mentioned moments ago, very often it's done to create a pleasing center image or nice sound stage for both the driver and the passenger seats, which sounds like a pretty good idea. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and Matt will jump in if I'm wrong. If you're using the same speaker locations that the factory used when they built this up mixer, is there any way we could just keep it and not worry too much about it, and don't worry about, you know, maintaining the 2-channel original thing because the up mixer is already in place? Like, you know, Rob just mentioned, we can definitely put in new speakers. We can put in more amplifiers so we can have a more dynamic system. But I mean, is it all bad, or can it be useful?
No, it could absolutely be useful, especially if the customer is fond of the up mixer, but they just want it to sound better. If they like the imaging, both, you know, maybe the customer and their significant other, maybe they both like to have the imaging in the center. So what we could do is we can maybe just tonally make it better by adjusting frequency response to a target and get the speakers to sound more like a, you know, a known good sounding target, make some by-ear adjustments, and likely the customer, if that's their style, you know, that'll make them happy. So,
okay. So if they have it and you need to keep it, it may not be all bad. So the battle's not lost, right?
Yeah.
So moving on, is there anything else, like can a fix help in some of these cases, or?
Yeah, fix can definitely help. Okay. So if there's no preamp solutions, there's no up mixer, we can use a fix, right? The only thing we need to consider when using a fix is, does the factory radio have an all-pass filter? Mm-hmm. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But with Max, we can test for that, right?
So hang on, just for everyone's benefit, what the fix processor will do, it's a JL Audio product. It can take a number of inputs into it and automatically reverse EQ, like take out any equalization, and sum the signals back together if they've been separated. And it can also compensate for system-wide delay. Anything that's showing up late, it will compensate for. But that does not work on all pass, since that is sort of frequency specific. It will not be able to compensate for an all pass filter. So now, how do we test for all pass filter?
All right. So all pass filters, you guys should already know how to test for this. You should have been watching the old other trainings from past weeks. We should already know how to do that. But if we need to test for an all pass filter, there's a couple different ways.
Just real quick.
Yeah, right. So with the normal method would be, we could inject signal into the factory radio and then measure the electrical outputs and see if there's an all-pass filter. Mm-hmm. Now, if they do not have an aux input, that's when we sort of get into what this session is mainly about, right? Which is if you don't have an aux input, how do you handle this situation? How do you get signal into the car and get time measurements out that are accurate and make sense? Now, if a fix will work, then it's easy. You just connect the fix like normal. You put your RCA or optical input directly into your amplifier, and you tune the car bypassing all the factory equipment. As long as the fix does its job and creates a flat full range signal, you're good to go.
Here.
Yep.
So perfect. Anything after this? Are we good, or?
So everything after this sort of becomes a compromise. All right. It's not our preferred method to get signal into the car. You end up having a poor signal that you're starting out with, which
potentially, yeah,
it can make the sound system not as good as it could be. Right, you're leaving things on the table. It may not hit its potential. So this is the worst case scenario. Can you make it sound good? Sure. There's sometimes you can absolutely make it sound good, but this should be your worst case scenario, your last resort. You should try all of the previous methods before you get to this method.
I know what a lot of guys are thinking right now is I've already been through all those other methods. This is where I'm at. So help me. This is why I'm watching.
Yeah, we've had a lot of guys that have been asking about this, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I believe Nick is ready to jump on the call here. Let's see, Rob, can you bring him in?
I sure can.
And there he is.
What's up, Nick?
Nick.
How you doing?
Howdy.
So Nick's joining us from our Phoenix location down in the desert over there. He's got a car behind him that's hopefully still working. And we're going to jump in and take some measurements from that car and kind of show you the way to get signal in and do some sort of time-based measurements using, as Matt has identified, somewhat of a compromised application here. It's not ideal. It is what it is, though. If you're at this point already, you've kind of checked all the other boxes. And for me, the big tell here is if there is no way to inject a signal other than a USB or a Bluetooth, this is kind of where most people are going to land. Right. So again, it's going to be a compromise because we're only going to really be able to focus on two things unless these guys can share with us a better way. So keep going. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to try and get through this quick so we can get into some measurements with Nick here. But the purpose of this is we're going to attempt to fix this post DSP signal. Right. It's already been changed by the factory amplifier or the radio, and now we're bringing in this signal that has been altered. It's not flat anymore. And it may not be time coherent. So we have to find a way to feed signal in that maintains time reference integrity. And how can we measure this? So it depends on how many inputs we're using, right? So if we're using 2 inputs, then we can compare left to right. So we can create a transfer function engine. We can use our measure signal as our left or right, either one, and the reference as the opposite, right? And what you can see from this is if one channel is delayed in time. And
so you're basically comparing left to right to see if one is arriving earlier or later than the other.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So, and you would do that using the impulse response. So you would compare, you'd make your transfer function in tune, you do your measure as your left, your reference as your right, and then you would look at your impulse response and you would see if there's any time, if they're at time 0. If it's at time 0 and there's no, it's the actual impulse starts right at the 0, then there is no delay. You don't have to change anything. But if there is delay, then what you'll see is the impulse will start after time 0. And then you can determine whether it's the left or the right channel based on how you hooked it up.
We're going to show you this. Don't worry.
And then we can also use the peak tracking like we did in the previous session. I think it was last week, we measured some all-pass filters that were on Tacoma radio, and it turns out there's 2. And you can use the impulse response peak tracking to you basically keep the impulse response while it's moving in time because you didn't have an aux in. We had to use a CD as our stimulus.
What? What's a CD?
A CD, right? So if we would jump more into the peak tracking, but that's not part of our session today, so we're not going to get too deep. But essentially, you can keep track of a signal that's not coming from max using periodic pink noise. It can lock onto a certain point and make it so you can read phase. And in that way, we're able to see all pass filters. The input EQ, anything that happened from the factory amplifier, will be accounted for during post EQ adjustments that you're doing with your microphone. And then any delay that's opposite, any delay that you had on one channel, when we're finished tuning, we'll add that same amount of delay to the other channel to nullify it. Okay.
All right.
So now, if we have more than 2 inputs, this is where it starts to get confusing. We need to use an external reference, right? And this is it's not as easy as a procedure. So, Nick, by any chance, do you have tune-up currently?
I do. However, the system that I have here to use today does not have more than 2 inputs. Its only input is a stereo 2-channel, but there's no aux in to the radio.
Okay. So we can still kind of fake it then, right?
I'm using Bluetooth into the radio, so I can show you, how to make measurements when you don't have a way to directly inject signal.
Excellent.
Yes, that's what we'll want to see. But is there any chance that you can show us the where the external reference lives? So how we can change that from the internal to the external reference for Max?
Sure. Yeah. Am I sharing my screen with you guys?
You are not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me.
So while Nick gets that ready for us, I just want to point out what Matt's doing is he's going down deeper into the stack here. He started off with the easiest way to do things, and he's getting into the more complex way of doing things. So again, if you're at this slide and you're still saying, yes, this is me, okay, keep watching, because we got some more stuff we're going to get into to show you how to do as much as is reasonably possible to get, and again, as it says on the slide, measuring the compromise. This is not ideal, especially when it comes to time-based measurements, but it is something that can be done so you can move forward. And I think there was a comment about getting significantly better performance than maybe if you didn't do some of these things. And that's the goal. So, all right, so Nick's got a screen going there.
So Matt, what were you? Tell me that again.
I just wanted to show where to find the internal reference and how we can change it to the external reference. So
yes, okay.
Looks like you already have a external reference there shown. So
yeah.
Real quick, Nick, can you go back a little bit and show how you got to the screen? So we're in Tune and we're on the Measure tab. And how did you find that screen?
So Measure tab, upper left corner.
Yep.
There's this Measure Settings button. Click that and then come to the Measurement Setup tab.
Perfect. Thank you.
Then under Reference Input, if you hover, the mouse cursor turns into a little hand, and you can see there's a little tooltip. In fact, if you just pause and don't move the mouse. So if you click in this area, then it opens up a dialog box where you can choose to either use the external RCA input that's on the hardware, or there's a relay that'll click and disconnect that RCA jack, and now it's looped back internally. So in this case, I'm going to use the external RCA input.
Right, and the default behavior is the internal reference. And Steve's got up on screen here, he's showing the reference input on the side of Max.
Yep. Yeah, so this is not the default. The default behavior is just like
internal,
that.
Right. So the internal one is it's basically like a wire connected from the output to that input, but it's just done internally. So this allows you to use an external reference to put it into Max as that reference, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so some of the topics that you guys touched on leading up to this, there's a whole lot of different things really that we covered, like many different concepts. So I think it's probably a good idea to just describe specifically what we're talking about right now. And that is simply how to, for example, Bluetooth a signal in from your phone and still make measurements, right? Now,
meaningful measurement.
In the case of this system, what I've got is I'm Bluetoothing in pink noise from my phone. And then that noise is connected to the OEM radio, and then the OEM radio is going through a module that's getting me, a stereo left-right signal. We could, in a future one, maybe do a real-time example of a slightly more complicated system where you don't have an integration module or something. But let's say that you do, like in the case of this, but you don't have any way to inject signal, right? So that's what we're doing here. So what I've done is in Tune, you can take any of the signals that are coming in anywhere, on any of its inputs, and route a sample of that signal to any of its outputs, basically. So that's what we're going to do in order to derive a reference signal. So in this case, like I've got the optical input that's coming from the module. So I've grabbed a sample of it right here, and I'm sending it out the RCA output. I've also got a sample of that optical signal going out of the optical output as well. And then I've fed both of those. Whoops, sorry about that. I fed both of those into Max. So we've got optical in, and then you can see we've got analog in. And the reason I did that is just so I can show you the difference between using the optical signal as my reference or the analog signal as my reference. Not much difference, but that choice is there. The overall point is that any signal that comes into VXI can also be routed out of VXI. So
and that would be,
reference
unless you
signal.
did otherwise, it would be an unprocessed signal. Like in the case of the optical, it's simply whatever comes in is exactly what goes out.
Whatever comes in is exactly what goes out. Yes. Yep. And on the analog side, so long as all this stuff is
Right. You
turned
don't
on.
have any high or low pass filters or any delay or any, all the settings are at zero, basically. Whatever comes in on the analog side can go out on the analog side as well without any alteration. So that
Yeah.
becomes a good reference point. It's the same signal that started is unaltered on its way out.
Yes, that's right.
Probably,
Now,
sorry, Nick, I say probably good practice is to make sure you right click on the outputs and reset the outputs for those pre-outs just to make sure.
Right on.
yeah, that's probably a good idea. Definitely. Yeah.
Cool. Good point, Rob. Thanks.
Okay, so let's say that you're doing this and the radio. Well, wait, sorry. Let me back up a second. Okay, so now that we have, let me close this window. So now that we've routed a sample of an input signal to one of our outputs, then what we can do is just take that output and connect it to max, right? So, for example, I've got the optical out connected to Max's optical in, and I've got one of the RCA outs connected to the RCA in. So right now, if I just open up my RTA and take a look at like my analog reference and my digital left, like these two, let's say, right? So these guys are a copy of that signal coming from the head unit, right? So let me make these lines thicker so we can see that a little more easily.
Don't worry, that's coming, guys.
Okay. And I'm going to hide these target responses real quick. We don't need those. Okay, so this purple one is the digital signal coming in on the optical, and this blue one is the analog signal coming in on the RCA, right? So you can see, like if I were to go and adjust the head unit's tone controls, you would see that happening right here on these traces, right? Because it's like a live view of what's coming out of that head unit, right? So we can also use this now as a timing reference for making acoustic measurements.
Right.
The challenge, though, is I'll show you what the only kind of downfall here is that the impulse responses are a little noisier generally, and there's a very good reason why that is, and I'll show you what that is also. But okay, so here's an impulse response, right? So like, for example, if I measure this front speaker that's hooked up, so the RTA is the RTA, right? It don't matter what your reference signal is. It just shows you the absolute tonal balance of whatever's playing, But the impulse response does rely on that reference signal. So you can see it's a little noisier than normal. But other than that, it's still the same kind of thing. It's an impulse response.
A fuzzy impulse response is better than no impulse response.
Yeah, so and that's one of the reasons too why I think it's important to get used to looking at them, get used to zooming in on them, get used to kind of understanding the structure of them. Because if you only rely on trying to let the automation stuff like the fine delay always give you delay values and things, then when you get into a situation like this where the impulse response is really noisy, the automatic delay finding stuff really won't work very well. And so, but you as a human, I can look at this and see the impulse response starts right here, and all this stuff over here is just noise.
It's just noise, yeah.
It's a pretty easy pattern to recognize, right? It's not.
Right.
Yeah, it's not like really hidden by the noise.
So Nick, just for my clarity, I may have zoned out on you. You're using Bluetooth to get the signal into this system, right?
I am. Yep, I'm Bluetoothing this signal in from an iPhone connected.
Okay, so it's Bluetooth in to the system, and you have the microphones in the driver's seat, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And when Nick talks, you can see the blue trace on the bottom, which is the RTA. You can kind of see it jumping because his voice is traveling through the car window and causing the microphone to pick up that signal. And you can also see on the top that the impulse response is being affected by the sound around as well. It's noise, it's garbage noise. But where his cursor is over there towards the right side of the screen, you can see a clear distinction from where the noise is versus where an actual impulse response is. And we're able to do this because the Bluetooth signal is not only being played through the audio system, but it's also being routed out and used as a reference. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Fantastic. Okay, cool. So we can see IR. This is awesome.
So Now, this isn't always the case. You can't always see the IR this clearly. So here's a question for you, Nick. Say you have a VXI and your input is front left, front right as inputs 1 and 2, and inputs 3 and 4 are rear left and rear right. You have to pick one of those signals to be your reference. So which one do you choose?
Well, what I would do, what I always recommend doing, always, is, especially if it's OEM integration of any kind,
right? Even
like with this, with the module, right? Always do this. Come into the setup and take, like, okay, so if it was channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it was front, rear, left, right, I would grab a sample of the front channel. This one, well, it's not going to let me mix analog and digital because I don't have error checking turned off. But anyway, I'd grab a sample of the input coming in on channel 1 and route that out my optical. And then I would look at it in the RTA and see. I'd look at the frequency response of that signal and see how wide of a bandwidth is it. Just like learn about that signal. Since you've already connected it to VXI, you basically have a free way now to just look at any of those signals by just routing them over to max with an optical cable. So I would look at them all and see what is their bandwidth, what are their relative levels. Like if one of them is really, really quiet or something, I don't know why it would be, but if it was, I would pick the louder one. If one of them had a very narrow bandwidth, if it was high passed or low passed or something, if it wasn't full range, I wouldn't pick that one. I'd pick the one that is full range, that kind of thing. So you would look for the signal which seems the most suitable for use as a reference, and its suitability is really how full range is it and how severely EQ'd is it, right?
Right.
Pick the one that's the least severely altered.
Right. Now let's say that these speakers are the factory radio inputs that are coming from the radio, the outputs, I'm sorry. Let's say the outputs have delay on those channels. This takes into account the delays, right? And it covers all the delays through the time of flight of the microphone and everything?
Yeah, it doesn't. Pardon me. Yes, it does. It wouldn't matter if the channels, like, for example, say you use the front left as your timing reference, right? Well, whatever difference in delay there is between the front right and the front left, or the rear right and the front left, or the rear left and the front left, it doesn't really matter, because that, as long as your timing reference stays the same, stays constant, then whenever you unmute those other speakers, wherever their position in time is relative to the one that's on the front, to your front left signal, then that is a constant thing. So they'll show up, in time, just like you're used to seeing, right? The speakers have different timing relationships, and so we account for that in the DSP. So yeah, you can use, as long as you stick with the same reference signal, right? You can use like the front left output as a reference.
Okay.
Pick one and run with it, huh?
Yeah.
And is it possible, is it just theory, is it possible for one of those signals to arrive later than the reference?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would it be a good practice to maybe just look at the arrival time of each channel and find the latest arriving one first and just set that as the reference?
Well, you could, as long as that latest arriving one didn't have some other thing that
Something else messing it
made
up.
it worse,
Right.
Yeah. So we want to find the best of the worst, right? So just to be clear, this is why we call it the compromise, right?
Right. Yeah. And I wish I had a system of that nature right here at my disposal, but I don't right at this